Welcome back to Askewed Reviews, and we are continuing the Valentine's recommendations, and this is a viewer request, and it is for the 1985 film, The Jewel of the Nile. Here is your trivia question for today. What is Joan Wilder's #1 best-selling book? The answer will be at the end of this episode. So our film starts off 6 months after the events of the last one. At this point, both Jack and Joan are out in the south of France, but it appears that not only is Joan dealing with writer's block, but it also seems like the romance has gotten a little stale. It's around this time that a charming man named Omar Khalifa, who happens to be an Arab ruler, asks Joan if she'd be willing to write his biography. Joan seems very excited at this opportunity, but Jack is not interested in going. In fact, he wants to just continue their trip and head on to Greece. So the two of them end up parting ways. So Jack, now hurt and alone, decides to head off on his own. But he's not alone for long, as he ends up running into Ralph from the first film, who Ralph seems happy to see him, but not in a good way. Pretty soon, though, both Jack and Ralph get interrupted by a member of the Sufi, who happens to be a group that is trying to kill Omar due to the fact that they believe he is an evil ruler and he wants to get his hands on the Jewel of the Nile. Hearing that, Ralph is immediately interested. Jack seems to take a little bit more convincing, though, not only by telling him that Jonah is in trouble, but by watching his boat get blown up. We then switch over to the deserts of Kadir, where Joan thinks that she's just doing an interview and book for a regular ruler. Unfortunately, she finds out pretty quickly Omar is not exactly what he seems. Eventually, Jack and Joan do get reunited, and now they'll take every plane, train, or camel to get away from Omar. And of course, the big question, who truly knows the whereabouts of the Jewel of the Nile? So Robert Zemeckis did not come back to direct the sequel. He was very busy working on his next project, Back to the Future. Danny DeVito actually offered to take over as director, but since by this point he had only directed a made-for-TV film, they weren't certain that he could handle it. Which is interesting, as he would go on to make quite a few good films. Louis Teague is who they would then bring in to replace Zemeckis as the director. And even though Alan Silvestri would become so tightly connected to Robert Zemeckis, he was willing to come back and score the sequel. Both Michael Douglas and Kathleen Turner were contractually obligated to come back for the sequel. Strangely enough, even though he was considered a villain in the first film, Danny DeVito was also contractually obligated to come back. Turner originally said that she would refuse to come back as she hated the original script. Luckily, after a meeting with her and Kirk Douglas and the studio, they ended up coming to an understanding and didn't end up having to sue her, which was a possibility. However that meeting went, it must have ended amicably due to the fact that Douglas and Turner, along with DeVito directing this time around, would come back together in the film The War of the Roses. Now, aside from the three main characters of Douglas, Turner, and DeVito, the only other returning character to this film was Holland Taylor's Gloria, who happened to be Joan's publisher. The main members of the Sufi tribe were actually an entire group known as the Flying Karamazov Brothers, who were professional jugglers. Did you happen to know that in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, there was an actor in that film that actually took inspiration from an actor in this film on how to portray their character? And that was actually Sean Connery playing Henry Jones Sr., and he actually modeled that character after Avner Eisenberg's version of Al Julhara from this film. Billy Ocean actually did the song When the Going Gets Tough, the Tough Get Going for this film. And you can actually see all three of the main characters appearing in the music video. Most of the film takes place in a fictitious location called Kadir. Now, in actuality, the movie was actually filmed in Morocco. Now, there was talks in 2005 of making a third film in the series, and that film would have either have been called The Crimson Eagle or Racing the Monsoon. Either way, though, it would have brought back Jack and Joan, and it would have had their two kids, which would more than likely have been teenagers, and this apparently would have taken place in Thailand. So when it comes to the film, The Jewel of the Nile, I do enjoy this movie, but I don't feel it's as good as the original. And part of that is, I think, the villain. I didn't feel Omar was as strong of a villain as Zola was. But it was still a fun movie to watch, so I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 5. Now, as for the trivia question from the beginning of this episode, what is Joan Wilder's #1 best-selling book? That book is called The Savage Secret. Now, you do get to see the cover a little bit in the first film, but the reason why it gets brought up as the bestseller in the second film is Omar is actually inspired by a torture scene, and that's where we get the sequence of Jack and Joan hanging from the rafters and having rats and acid causing both of them to fall to their doom. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Askewed Reviews, and if there's a movie you'd like to see get a review, just mention it in the comments.